Chapters 28, 31, and 34. Chapter 28. The Ottoman Empire was usually a prominent frontier state. The founder of the Ottoman Empire was Osman Bey. The dynasty was unbroken and successful from 1289 to 1923. The Ottomans heavily focused on religion. They hoped to become Ghazi, which are Muslim religious warriors. They were located on the borders of the Byzantine Empire. This location made it easy to wage holy war. The first victory was in 1326 with the capture of the city of Bursa. In 1352, they had finally established a foothold in Europe. Bursa developed into a commercial and intellectual center. Through an institution called Devshirme, the youth Christian population was converted to Janissaries. Muhammad II captured Constantinople. This became the new capital. Muhammad the Conqueror laid foundation for an absolute monarchy. Ottoman expansion was promoted in Southwest Asia and Europe by Suleiman the Magnificent. The Safavid Empire. In the year 1499, 12-year-old Ismail entered Tabriz at the head of an army in order to exact revenge on his family's enemies. He became the Shah. He ruled from 1501 to 1524. He claimed Twelver Schism as the official religion. Ismail's ancestry was traced back to Sufi al-Din, eventually leading him to naming his group the Safavids. The Safavid religion changed several times, but they eventually settled on following Schism. In 1519, the Battle of Taldarin occurred between the Safavids and the Ottomans, leaving both empires damaged and in conflict for 2 centuries. The Safavid Empire was finally completely revitalized when a new ruler was appointed. This was the Shah Abbas the Great. He ruled from 1588 to 1629.
The Mughal Empire. Babur was a Shaghatai Turk who claimed descent from both Chinggis Khan and Tamerlane. He mounted invasions in India from 1523 to 1525 and took Delhi in 1526. He founded the Mughal dynasty, which embraced almost the entire Indian subcontinent by 1530. His grandson Akbar was said to be the real architect of the empire. He created a centralized administrative structure with ministries to regulate provinces. He also began to promote expansion when he absorbed the recently defeated Vijayanagar kingdom. Akbar pursued a policy of religious tolerance to reduce tension between Hindus and Muslims. He encouraged the development of the divine faith, which made the empire ruler common to all social, religious, and ethnic groups of India. The Mughal Empire reached its peak under Aurangzeb and ruled the entire subcontinent except for a small region at the tip. He was a devout Muslim and broke Akbar's policy of religious tolerance. He destroyed Hindu temples and taxed Hindus to encourage conversion to Islam. Imperial Islamic Society, the dynastic state. The Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughal empires were all military creations made through conquest, and they were regarded as personal possessions by their rulers. The prestige and authority of the Mughal, Safavid, and Ottoman dynasties derived from the personal piety and military prowess of the ruler and his ancestors. The Ghazi ideal to spread Islam by fighting infidels or heretics resonates with the Turkish and Mongolian traditions where successful warriors led to charismatic leaders. Spiritual authority was very important. Ottoman sultans issued many legal edicts such as the Kanun issued by Suleiman or Suleiman Kanuni, the lawgiver, to assert this authority. Similar things were done by the Safavids and the Mughals. Shah Ismail forced the Shiite religion on his subjects, and Akbar issued a decree in 1579 claiming this authority. Muslim theorists universally agreed that women should have no role in politics and public affairs, but women still played important roles in managing Islamic empires. One example is Shah Jahan, who let his wife run the government. His devotion to her was shown in the Taj Mahal. Agriculture and trade. The Columbian Exchange introduced food crops but didn't affect the Islamic empires as greatly as it did Europe. Coffee and tobacco consumption became strongly encouraged. Coffee houses were made for people to enjoy both coffee and tobacco at the same time. Traditional agriculture resulted in more population growth than the introduction of new crops. India reached 165 million people in the 1700s. The Ottomans and the Safavids were more interested in foreign trade compared to the Mughals, mostly because the Mughals had little part in maritime affairs and liked to focus on themselves. Many Europeans sought Safavid raw silk, carpets, ceramics, and more.
All the Islamic empires had populations that were religiously and ethnically diverse. Although diversity created challenges to the rule of the empires, the Ottomans included large numbers of Christians and Jews in the Balkans, Armenia, Lebanon, and Egypt. The Safavid embraced Zoroastrian and Jewish communities as well, while most Mughals were Hindus. Religious diversity in India under the rule of Akbar contained the following, known as Portuguese Guavang, the center of the Christian missions, as well as the advocated syncretic divine faith. This emphasized loyalty to the emperor while borrowing electrically from different religious traditions. Divine faith was strictly monotheistic, reflecting the influence of Shi and Sufi teachings. Akbar also referred to himself as the Lord of Wisdom. As for religious minorities, were generally tolerated in Islamic states. Islamic emperors did not require conquered peoples to convert to Islam, but extended them to the status of dhimmi protected people. Dhimmi communities retained their personal freedom, kept property, practiced their religion, and handled their legal affairs. In the Ottoman Empire, conquered people protected, granted, protected, granted religious and civil autonomy in their own communities, while in India, the Muslim rulers closely cooperated with Hindu majority. Adding on, under the Aurangzeb, Islam proclaimed official state religion, while non-believers taxed. In cultural patronage of Islamic emperors, all three sponsored arts and public works like mosques, palaces, schools, hospitals, and many more. In Istanbul, capital cities and royal palaces were the most visible expressions of imperial majesty, also known as the Ottoman capital, containing a bustling city of 1 million people. The heart of Istanbul was the Great Topkapi Palace, housing government officials and sultan's residence. Sinan Ushu built a vast religious complex based on Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, called the Suleiman, which blended Islamic and Byzantine architectural elements. Shah Abbas made this capital, Isfahan, into the queen of Persian cities, and one of the most precious jewel of urban architectural development anywhere in the world. Mughals constructed sacred of mosques, fortresses, and palaces, and sometimes created ancillary cities. A great example was Fatehpur Sikri, a city planned and constructed by Akbar that served as his capital from 1569 to 1585. This combined Islamic style with Indian elements. Unfortunately, it was a poor site for the city and was abandoned due to bad water supply. The most famous of Mughal monuments and one of the most prominent of all Islamic edifices was the Taj Mahal, as well as an exquisite example of that architecture. The Islamic empires underwent dramatic changes between the 16th and 18th centuries. The deterioration of imperial leadership, the dynastic decline was later caused by negligent rulers, factions, and government corruption, affecting all three dynasties. Thus, tensions increased when religious conservatives abandoned policies of tolerance. In the Ottoman Empire, disaffected religious students often joined the Janissaries in revolt. As Ottoman conservatives also revolted, innovations like the telescope and printing press, while in the Safavid Empire, Shiite leaders urged the Shahs to persecute Sunnis, non-Muslims, and even the Sufis. Leading on, in the Mughal India, Aurangzeb policies provoked deep animosity of Hindus.
Chapter 28, Section 4. The Mughals' economy and military began to decline due to the unnecessary wars, which resulted in corruption from politicians and also tax rates, which also made individuals from this place to hate the government and just like want to rise against them, and also their financial problems and The military decline was due to Europe which weakened them by promoting European weapons, and basically even the Ottomans pushed some vessels, and that caused them to just overall um, not have a good economy. And the superiority complex of many Muslims drove them to ignore the West and its technological advances. For example, the telescope or the printing press, which the printing press was something that they really didn't like because they saw it as like something from Europeans, and something that if they let that like go through the countries, they would have like European oppression or something. And for that reason, they banned it. However, that ban was lifted on 1729, and basically the politicians from this place had a lot of fear of innovations from Europeans and just everyone else in the world. So they just like decided to ignore all the innovations going on around them and advances, and that slowly drove to the decline of India.
Chapter 31: The United States, Westward Expansion and Civil War. While the U.S. continued to solve problems with the Constitution, Americans had begun expansion westward, gaining all the land from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. This caused America to double in size. The Louisiana Purchase then again allowed America to double in size. This expansion brought talk of the manifest destiny. The indigenous people refused to leave their homelands. However, white America continued to force them to Oklahoma, resulting in the Trail of Tears. The movement of the indigenous people was supported by the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Westward expansion also caused tension between the U.S. and Mexico. Texas, California, and New Mexico at this time were all a part of Mexico. However, Texas declared independence in 1836 and in 1845 became a part of America. Conflict within Texas led to the Mexican-American War. Mexico lost, and America took control of one half of Mexico's territory for only $15 million. Many hoped that slavery would end due to the Constitution. However, cash crops such as cotton caused for a rise in the use of slavery throughout America. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 sparked war between slave states and free states, resulting in a civil war. Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st of 1863, changing the tides of war. The victory of the northern states ended slavery in the U.S. The Canadian Dominion, independence without war. Canada did not fight a war for independence. Instead, independence was gained gradually as Canadians and the British agreed on general principles of autonomy. Two ethnic groups were dominant in Canada. This was French and British Canadians. Ethnic division could have ended Canada. However, the War of 1812 did the opposite and encouraged unity. America attempted to conquer Canada but failed. Soon after, Canada experienced an era of rapid growth. Fear of U.S. expansion and internal conflict in Britain resulted in Britain granting independence to Canada. The British North American Act of 1867 joined many provinces and recognized them as the Dominion of Canada.
Simón Bolívar was titled South America's Liberator, and he worked for the establishment of a large confederation that would provide Latin America with political, military, and economic strength against foreign powers. Creole elites established written constitutions for newly independent states of Latin America but still dominated those states and prevented mass participation in public affairs. This led to political instability and rebellions. Elites agreed on claiming land for agriculture and ranching and displacing indigenous people to establish a Euro-American hegemony in Latin America. Division and discord in the new states helped caudillos or regional military leaders come to power. The most notable caudillo was Juan Manuel de Rosas, who restored order to Argentina. In Mexico, political turmoil was caused by the Mexican-American War. This ultimately led to a liberal reform led by Juárez. The goal of La Reforma was to shape Mexican society by limiting the power of military and the Roman Catholic Church. Juárez suspended loan payments to foreign powers, which led to the Spanish, French, and British intervening until paid. Napoleon III from France attempted to end Mexican disorder and recreate a monarchy, but failed as Mexican forces prevented them from doing so. On May 5, 1862, which is now known as Cinco de Mayo. The Mexican Revolution lasted for 10 years from 1910 to 1920. The Mexican citizens united together to overthrow the dictator Porfirio Diaz. Emiliano Zapata and Francisco or Pancho Villa were rebels who organized armies for land and liberty. However, they weren't entirely successful because the Mexican Revolution ended soon after Zapata and Villa were killed. Government forces regained control, but the Mexican Constitution of 1917 gave hopes to the citizens. American economic development, migration to the Americas. Mass migration of European and Asian peoples to US, Canada, and Latin America greatly stimulated the economy. Gold discoveries in California drew in the most people, but people were also drawn by gold in Canada. By the 1850s, about 2.3 million Europeans had migrated to the United States. Poles, Russian Jews, Slavs, Italians, Greeks, and Portuguese were most prominent among migrants. Asian migrants contributed to the construction of an American transportation infrastructure. Between 1852 and 1857, 200,000 Chinese migrated to California.
Whereas migrants to the United States contributed to the development of an industrial society, those who went to Latin American lands mostly worked on agricultural plantations. About 4 million Italians saw opportunities in Argentina to the 1880s and 90s, migrated to Brazil and Argentina, while Asians migrated to Cuba and the Caribbean sugar fields. A form of economic expansion in the United States was the British capital, crucial for early development in U.S. industries by helping business people establish a textile industry. The foreign capital supported textile, iron, and steel, as well as railroads, stable white, and governed states and colonies were especially fertile grounds for British investment, while often provided the impetus for industrial expansion and economic independence in more regions. In the case of the US, it helped create a rival industrial power that would eventually outperform Britain's economy. The railroads integrated national economy of the late 19th century. By 1900, there was 200,000 miles of railroad track in the United States coast to coast. Quite apart from the transportation services they provided, railroads spurred the development of other industries. They required huge amounts of coal, wood, glass, and rubber, and by the 1880s, some 75% of U.S. steel went to the railroads industry. Ultimately, railroads changed American landscapes and timetables, setting time zones by 1880s, a dramatic economic growth between 1870 and 1900. New inventions and technologies developed, known as electric lights, telephones, typewriters, phonographs, film photography, motion picture cameras, and electric monitors. Large-scale labor conflicts over wages and working conditions took place. Usually big businesses won. British investment deeply influenced the development of Canadians as well as the U.S. economy. In the 19th and early 20th century, the national policy was a plan to develop the national economy, as its goal was to attract migrants and British capital, but to protect Canadian industries. The Canadian Pacific Railroad opened the Western Prairie lands to commerce, stimulated the development of other industries, and promoted the emergence of the Canadian national economy. A boom was brought in agricultural and industrial production, late 19th and 20th centuries. A heavy U.S. investment in Canada was brought and owned 30% of Canadian industry by 1918. Moving on, Latin American dependence, colonial legacy prevented industrialization of Latin American states. Moreover, Spain and Portugal never encouraged industries, while Creole elites continued land-based economies after independence. While British merchants had little desire to transform Latin American states into dependent trading partners for simple reasons that they offered. They instead invested in um, cattle and sheep in Argentina. Argentina became Britain's principal supplier of wool and beef. Most profits most of profits returned to Britain. Meanwhile, some attempts at industrialization with limits
One limited success was Porfirio Diaz encouraging foreign investors to build railroads, telegraphs, and mines in all ports of Mexico. But the profits from Mexican enterprises did not support continuing industrial development. Instead, it went to the pockets of a Mexican oligarchy and foreign investors who supported Diaz. Even as agriculture, railroad construction, and mining were booming, the standard of living for average Mexicans had begun to decline by the early 20th century. Despite a large proportion of foreign and especially British control, Latin American economies expanded rapidly in the late 19th century. Economic growth was driven by exports. These products were mostly silver, beef, bananas, and coffee.
The USA was dominated by white elites on the 19th century, which drove them to the Dewis Act on 1887, which was basically an act which encouraged Native people to take up farming to civilize them, according to them. And other than that, there were other attempts being made to civilize these Native children. For example, the boarding schools, and they were basically supposed to take their native languages and just traditions and overall their roots and everything. And freed slaves were often denied civil rights even after they gained freedom, especially on the South. And even after Reconstruction, a violent backlash was eventually overturned reforms to ensure that African Americans had their rights. And other attempts for equality were being made. For example, the Declaration of Sentiments by American women, which sought to gain equality and just political rights and employment. And the USA was going through a really good time during this whole thing because Europeans and just everyone was moving in. For example, 25 million Europeans migrated to USA during 1840s to 1914, and that just made the U.S. economy have a complete boost on it and just go insane. And Latin American society was basically ruled by machismo and your legacy. And machismo is basically the word for the patriarchy and just everything about male being better than women, just everything else. And watches were made a cultural impact on Latin America because they were Argentinian cowboys.
Chapter 34: Nationalist Aspirations. Nationalism was spread through most of Europe, along with the idea of self-determination. Some countries ignored the idea of self-determination. However, Germans, Belgians, and Italians sought out nationalism via self-determination. Belgium gained independence in 1830. Italy was unified in 1861, and in 1871 Germany was unified. Multinational empires struggled to achieve self-determination, often due to problems in the balance of power. The Ottoman Empire, that had once controlled the Balkan territories, began to shrink after 1829. In 1830, Greece was the first to gain independence from the Ottoman. Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria did the same not long after. As the Ottoman territories were taken over by nationalism, Russia began pushing Slav nationalism. Austria-Hungary didn't like this, so they attempted to counter it by gaining German support. National rivalries. Major European powers were experiencing dangerous rivalries because nationalism was manifesting economic competition and colonial conflicts. Germany's rapid industrialization threatened British economic predominance. Tension grew with the expensive naval race between the two parties. Super battleships known as dreadnoughts were built. During this time, basically all major powers engaged in a scramble for empire. A general European war was almost started between 1905 and 1914 due to a series of international crises and two local wars. Understandings and alliances. Rival alliance systems produced a system in which even the smallest event could cause global war. By 1914, Europe's major powers had formed two rival alliances, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. These central powers worked in order to protect the political status quo in Europe. However, keeping peace was very difficult because the country had inflexible military plans. Global War. War made it to Europe during harvest time. Many were unhappy, However, much of the youth had been expecting war and believed it would fix political, social, and economic crisis. War was expected to be fast, however, it quickly became a war of attrition, mutual butchery. Many thought that the war would be brief, but within the first few weeks of August 1914, 20 million young men set out for war. The war plans of this time paid no attention to defense and instead focused on swift, head-on triumphs. Trenches on the Western Front stretched from the English Channel to Switzerland. Italy had left the Triple Alliance because they favored neutrality. However, Italy, by the year of 1915, entered the war on the side of the Allies.
Stalemate and new weapons. Throughout the war, defensive tactics such as barbed wire on no man's land was developed and used to frustrate the enemy. Any infantry charges across no man's land were considered suicide missions due to machine guns. These machine guns represented important technological advances for military weapons. German troops introduced poisonous gas or mustard gas in 1915. Mustard gas was known to kill people by rotting their body from the inside out. Some died 4 to 5 weeks later after exposure. Machine guns and poisonous gas were so powerful that 120 million soldiers died in total. Tanks and airplanes were also introduced. Tanks helped German counterattacks regain land, and airplanes improved speed, range, and altitude for aerial attacks. In 1916, the Germans assaulted the French fortress of Verdun. 315,000 French died, while 280,000 Germans died. The British attempted a counterattack at the Somme and gained a few thousand yards of land at the cost of 420,000 casualties. Neither side gained strategic advantage. Total war, the home front. The term total war represented how entire societies were fighting, not just armies. This led to the distinction of military front and the home front, which expressed the effects on the economy. As the men went off to war, the women took over factory jobs and management of businesses and farms left behind. The most important job for women was the making of shells. Millions of women worked to make them, and many died due to the dangers of the job. Women were given voting rights in Britain, Germany, and Austria after their role in the war. Some governments used restriction of civil liberties, censorship of bad news, and vilification of the enemy through propaganda campaigns. Examples of propaganda include posters, pamphlets, and fake studies that depicted the enemy as subhuman savages. These were all used to maintain home front spirit. Conflict in East Asia and the Pacific. There were 3 main reasons why the war expanded to multiple countries. The first was that European governments carried their animosities into their colonies. The second was that millions of men were recruited from multiple colonies of the main combatants. Last but not least, many had different motives to join other than the main reasons that caused the war. Japan entered the war on August 15, 1914, but demanded that Germany withdrew its ships from Japan if it wanted supports. The Germans refused, and Japan joined the Allies.
The Central Powers were basically Japan, Italy, and Germany, and that was when the U.S. joined the war. The U.S. really helped to make them collapse, and that was under the President Woodrow Wilson, which that forced them to accept armistices, which was in 1918, with basically like treaties to make sure that they wouldn't do that again, in like a way to make sure that they paid for what they did. And the Great War left 15 million people dead, and it really weakened Europe because there were so many fights going on at that time that their economy was really bad and just everything was on ruins. And the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 did not include the Central Powers, and it was made to fix the war issues that happened on territory and just more things that were undecided when when Germany fell, and just everyone on the Central Power side. And the U.S. President Wilson introduced 14 points as a proposal for peace, which included more association within countries. That was later called the League of Nations. However, this was a failure since Congress didn't accept it, and the League of Nations didn't have the support it needed because the U.S. didn't accept it because of the Congress. So eventually, that just fell apart, and it never ended up happening. and peace treaties weakened Germany's military. And that was the Paris Peace Treaty and the conference in which the French really made sure that Germany had no longer any military or anything to defend themselves anymore, so they wouldn't do this in a future invasion. Mustafa Kemal kicked the Allied forces out of Turkey, and that basically gave him the title of father of the new Turkey, and that he was really like forward with everything he said, and that he wanted more rights for women and just more European laws, but in a way that was not European like agenda type of thing. And self determination was introduced by President Wilson, which encouraged new states to form and mandate system on the U.S. Opposed direct colonization, which led to German, Ottoman, African colonies to be distributed between the Allied forces. As a result, angry Arabics created a Balfour Declaration, which basically allowed for a Jewish state to keep them away, which they really didn't like Jewish. They thought they were taking their stuff away. So they just decided to make sure they had a country so they wouldn't be interfering within their actions or within their own country. And that's all.